My name is Garrett Hollis. I'm 41 years old. For the last 15 years, I've been a diesel mechanic at the West Side Bus Depot on Collier Avenue, the City Transit Authority. Big orange building with the cracked parking lot. You've driven past it 1,000 times without looking at it. That's me. That's where I spent my days. Under buses mostly. Sometimes inside them, sometimes hanging off the side of them. I know every system on every model of city bus that this transit authority has operated since 2009, which is not information that seemed important until recently. My wife is Claire. She was a dental hygienist until about 8 months ago, when the practice she worked at closed down, and she'd been doing substitute receptionist work at a couple of different offices since then, taking whatever hours came up. We've been married 11 years. We don't have kids. We have a dog named Russ, a big brown mutt, who I found sleeping under one of the buses about 4 years ago, and who currently lives in this office with me, sleeping on an old shop rag that he's decided is a bed. That's me. That's the short version. Here's how it started. It was a Tuesday. I know that because on Tuesdays, I was always the one who came in early to pull the repair orders for the week, and I'd gotten in around 6:30, which meant I was already 4 hours into my shift when everything happened. I was underneath bus 2219, a 2017 Nova LFS that had been throwing a check engine code related to the after-treatment system, which is a polite way of saying the exhaust system for diesel engines. And it's the kind of fault that'll fail your emissions test, but won't actually stop the bus from running. Low priority. I'd been putting it off. So I'm under there, on the creeper, looking up at the underside of the exhaust system, and I've got grease on both forearms, and probably my face, and my phone goes off in my shirt pocket. I let it ring. I was in the middle of checking something. It rang again. I rolled out, sat up, looked at the screen. Claire. She called me at work maybe twice a year. Not because we had a bad marriage, just because she knew I was busy and she was busy, and we both had the same approach to phone calls, which was that they were for information transfer and not extended conversation. If something was important, she'd text. If she called, it was because texting wasn't enough. I answered. The sound that came out of my phone didn't immediately make sense to me. It was layered. There was Claire's voice, and there was a lot of other noise underneath it, and it took me a second to sort out what I was hearing. I heard her saying my name, Garrett, Garrett, and I heard what sounded like people screaming but far away, like a crowd noise, and I heard something that I can only describe as wet, which is not a helpful description, but it's the only one I have. Claire, I'm here. What's happening? She said, and I can still hear exactly how she said it, the pitch of it, the way her breath was short. She said, I'm at Bresner's. Garrett, there are people. People are biting each other. I didn't say anything for a second. She said, I'm serious. I'm in the cereal aisle and a man he bit another man and he won't let go, and people are running and I can't. Garrett, what do I do? I was already on my feet. I don't remember standing up. I was just suddenly standing. Where are you exactly? Are you okay? Are you hurt? I'm okay. I'm at the end of the aisle by the pharmacy counter. I'm behind the pharmacy counter. There's a woman back here with me. She works here, and we pushed the little half door shut, but more noise behind her. I couldn't tell what it was. Claire, listen. Stay right where you are. Don't open that door. You hear me? Don't open it. Garrett, I'm coming. I'm leaving right now. Stay where you are. I hung up, not to be dramatic about it, just because I needed both hands and I needed to move. Walt was across the shop, working on the driver's side door panel of bus 2204. Walt Burgess, 62 years old, 30 years at the depot, the kind of mechanic who could diagnose a problem by sound alone from 40 feet away. He was the one who'd taught me half of what I know. I told him I had a family emergency and I was leaving. He started to say something about the 2219, about the repair order, and I said I had to go. I'd call Dennis. I didn't call Dennis. Dennis Farrow was the yard supervisor, and he was going to ask questions, and I didn't have time for questions. I went to my locker first, not because I had some prepared go bag or anything like that. I didn't. I'd never been a prepper. The idea of spending a weekend building emergency kits had always seemed to me like the kind of thing that people who were afraid of everything did, instead of living their lives. What I had in my locker was a change of clothes, a half-empty pack of ibuprofen, my other set of keys, a small LED flashlight I'd bought because the shop lights went out twice last winter, and a Leatherman multi-tool that I'd gotten as a birthday gift from Claire 3 years ago and never used at work but always kept there for some reason. I took the flashlight and the Leatherman. I put the ibuprofen in my jacket pocket. I thought for a second, and grabbed the change of clothes too, shoved them into the bag I use for my lunch. Then I went to the parts room. The parts room at the depot isn't dramatic. It's metal shelving stacked with filters and fuses and hose clamps and lubricants and a bunch of other boring mechanical components. But if you know what you're looking at, there are useful things. I grabbed 2 one-gallon jugs of distilled water that we used for battery maintenance. I grabbed a roll of electrical tape. I grabbed a pair of heavy work gloves from the bin by the door. I grabbed a small bolt cutter that we used to get into locked access panels on buses we had to work on fast. I don't know why I grabbed the bolt cutter. I wasn't thinking clearly. I was operating on some channel below conscious thought. My hands were making decisions before my brain finished processing. I also grabbed a long pry bar off the rack. Useful tool. I told myself it was useful, and not that I was afraid of what Claire had described on the phone. On my way out through the shop, I passed Dennis's office. He was in there on the phone, which was unusual. Dennis almost never made calls from his office. He was usually out on the floor. He had his back to the glass, and he was talking fast. I could see through the window that his computer had a news website up, not the Transit Authority intranet, and there were red alert banners across the top of the page. I didn't stop. I kept walking. Out through the side exit, across the back corner of the vehicle yard, to my truck. A 2009 Ford F-150 with a cracked dash and a dent in the passenger door from a shopping cart incident 3 years ago that I'd never gotten around to fixing. The truck started on the first turn, which I was grateful for, because she'd been a little rough on cold mornings lately. Bresner's was the big grocery store on Whitmore Avenue, about 2.5 miles from the depot. The direct route was straight down Collier to the intersection, then east on Whitmore. That would take me through the main commercial strip by the library and past the community center, which is always busy during the day. I took Randall Street instead. Randall runs parallel to Collier, but 1 block south, through a neighborhood of old bungalows and a couple of small auto shops. Nobody much uses it, because the pavement is bad and there are speed bumps every other block. I knew it because I'd driven it 100 times on lunch breaks going to the sandwich place on DuPont. It added about 4 minutes. It didn't matter. I needed to see what was happening before I drove into the middle of it. What I saw on Randall Street, nothing unusual. A woman walking a dog. A delivery truck parked in front of a house. An old guy watering his yard. What I saw when I came out onto Monroe Street to cut across. An ambulance going east at speed, with no lights or sirens, which seemed wrong, and a police cruiser sitting diagonally across the far lane of Monroe, empty, driver's door open, no officer visible. The cruiser's lights were going. Its radio was squawking something I couldn't make out through my closed windows. I turned left, away from the cruiser, and took the long way around on Beaumont. Beaumont to Fitzgerald, to a right turn on 14th, and then south on 14th to Whitmore, the back approach to Bresner's. The whole drive took 11 minutes. I know, because I was watching the clock on my dash the entire time, counting minutes since Claire called. What I saw on the way, 4 more abandoned vehicles, one with its engine still running, and the door open, steam coming from under the hood like it had bumped something. I saw a group of maybe 8 or 9 people running, not jogging, running, east along the sidewalk on Beaumont, running away from something. I couldn't see what. I saw a man standing in the middle of Fitzgerald Street, with blood on his shirt, just standing there, not moving, looking at nothing. I drove around him slowly. He didn't react to the truck. He just stood there. He didn't look hurt, exactly. He looked like something had gone out of him, like someone had removed a part that made him work. I didn't stop. I kept driving. Whitmore Avenue, when I came out onto it, was chaos. Not organized emergency chaos. Random, directionless chaos. The kind that happens when a lot of people are doing a lot of different things that don't fit together. There were cars stopped in both lanes, and some of them had people in them who were just sitting, and some of them were empty, and one car near the intersection had its front end against a light pole, and the airbag had deployed, and there was nobody in the seat. I could see Bresner's from here. Big brick building with the orange and white signs. The parking lot was partly visible from Whitmore, and what I could see was a lot of stuff on the ground. Carts overturned, things scattered across the pavement, a couple of cars with their doors open, and people moving in a way that didn't look like grocery shopping. I couldn't get to the main entrance from here. There were 3 stopped vehicles blocking the turn into the parking lot, and one of them had its hazards on, and none of them were moving. I pulled up onto the curb and sat for a second with the engine running, looking at the lot. The main entrance, the sliding doors at the front of Bresner's, had a crowd around it, or something like a crowd. It was hard to tell from this angle what was happening, but it didn't look like something I could walk through. I thought about Claire behind the pharmacy counter. I thought about her telling me to stay where you are. I thought about the layout of Bresner's, which I'd been in probably 300 times since it opened 6 years ago. I knew the back. I knew Bresner's received deliveries through a loading dock on the east side of the building, off a service road that ran behind the strip mall. If the back delivery doors were unlocked, and at this time of day they almost certainly would be, since the morning delivery trucks had probably already been there, I could get in without going through the front. I put the truck in drive, backed off the curb, and went around the block. The service road was accessible from 14th Street via a narrow break between a nail salon and a dry cleaner that I'd never noticed before. I only found it because I'd pulled up slow, and I was looking at every possible gap in the buildings. It was barely wide enough for the truck, and there was a dumpster about halfway down that I had to ease around, and then the service road opened up and I could see the back of Bresner's loading dock. 2 delivery trucks were backed up to the dock, both still hooked to their trailers, both cabs empty. The dock doors were open, all 3 of them, which meant someone had been in the middle of receiving a delivery when something happened. I parked behind the delivery trucks where my truck was mostly hidden, grabbed the pry bar and the bag from the passenger seat, and got out. The service road was quiet. That was the thing that struck me first. The noise from Whitmore Avenue, car horns, some distant screaming, a sound that I still can't describe accurately, sort of a collective murmur that wasn't quite human. That noise was there when I listened for it. But here, behind the building, it was muffled. Birds, the hum of the refrigeration units on the delivery trailers. I walked up the dock steps fast, keeping close to the building, through the first open dock door, into the receiving area. It was dim in there. The overhead fluorescents were on, but a couple were flickering, and the whole space had the feel of something interrupted. There was a pallet of canned goods sitting half-wrapped in shrink plastic, not finished yet. A clipboard on the floor next to a handcart, like someone had dropped it mid-task. A pair of reading glasses on top of a cardboard box, the kind you'd set down to look at something more closely and then forget. I moved through the receiving area into the stockroom. The stockroom at a grocery store like Bresner's is a place most people never see. It's where the building gets organized before the organized part shows up on the shelves. Metal shelving from floor to ceiling. Supplies in various states of processing. The back sides of all the refrigerated sections accessible from here. A cold room behind a heavy insulated door for meat and dairy. It smelled like cardboard and refrigerant, and something sweet. Probably because someone had broken a bottle of juice near the back shelving unit and not fully cleaned it up. And there were 2 people in the stockroom who were not employees. I came around the end of the first shelving row and almost walked into them. A man and a woman, mid-30s probably. She was holding a reusable shopping bag, and he had his hand on her arm, and they both made the exact same sound when they saw me, this short, shocked noise that I probably also made when I saw them. We all stood there for about a second. Then the woman said, Do you work here? I said, No, I'm looking for someone. My wife. She called me and said. The man said, Don't go out front. Do not go out front. I said I wasn't planning to. His name was Kevin Marsh. He told me this right away, like he needed me to know it. He turned out to be a cop, off duty. He'd been picking up groceries for his girlfriend before the start of his evening shift. The woman with him was Tina Holbrook, a customer he'd ended up near when things started, and who was holding her shopping bag so tight her knuckles were white. She had a kid, she told me, a toddler. He was outside the store with her mother. They'd been about to go in when they heard the commotion and stayed put. I asked Kevin what had happened. He'd been near the deli counter, he said. He'd seen the first one, a man in the deli line who'd turned to the person next to him and just grabbed him. No words, no warning, nothing. Just grabbed him and bit into his neck and wouldn't let go. Kevin said his first instinct was to pull them apart, and then he saw the man's face, and he stopped. He said the man's eyes were wrong. He couldn't describe it better than that. Just wrong. Kevin had cleared people back, tried to use his off-duty voice to establish some control, called 911. The 911 line had rung busy. He'd called dispatch on his personal radio. He carried his personal radio off-duty, standard for the department, and got through. But what came back was a lot of competing traffic and nobody responding directly to him. More biting incidents started in other parts of the store within about 10 minutes of the first one. Kevin said it spread fast, too fast, faster than any kind of violence he'd seen before. I said, "My wife, Claire Hollis. She said she was behind the pharmacy counter." Kevin said, "Pharmacy is on the north wall, far side of the registers." He'd tried to get there himself, to help people who'd gotten stuck, but the situation had closed off the main floor area too fast. He and Tina had retreated to the stockroom. I asked if anyone was back here. He nodded. He led me through the stockroom, around the cold room door, to a secondary storage area on the north side of the building. A different set of shelves back here, less organized. This was overflow storage, seasonal stuff, cleaning supplies. And back behind those shelves, in a kind of alcove formed by the shelving unit and the wall, there were 6 people. Claire was one of them. When I saw her, I had to stop walking for a second because my knees did something weird. Just a brief mechanical failure. She saw me at the same moment, and she covered her mouth with both hands, and for a second, neither of us moved. Then I crossed the space between us, and she grabbed me around the middle, and I put my arms around her and held on. She was shaking. Not obviously, she was too controlled for that, but I could feel it through her clothes, this fine vibration. "You okay?" I said. "I'm okay." A pause. "I didn't think you'd be this fast." "I was already on my way," I said. The other people in the alcove, a pharmacy technician named Brenda, middle-aged, wearing the blue polo shirt from the pharmacy counter, who had a cut on her hand from where she'd pushed through a broken glass panel to get into the back when things started. A teenage kid, maybe 17, name was Scott, dark hoodie, came in to buy energy drinks and ended up here. An older man named Paul, who'd been in the store buying paper towels, and who was sitting on the floor now, with his back against the shelving unit, saying nothing, looking at nothing. The same expression on his face that the man on Fitzgerald Street had. Except this one wasn't infected. This one was just in shock. And an employee, a kid named Dustin, who stocked the overnight shift and had stayed late finishing a section, 19 years old, wearing his work apron. 7 people, counting me, in a storage alcove behind a grocery store. I did a quick look at everyone. I needed to know if anyone was bitten, because I'd already put together in my head what the biting meant, even if I hadn't said the word yet. Kevin was ahead of me. He was asking Brenda about the cut on her hand, asking how she got it, whether it was from contact with anyone who was infected. She said no, it was glass. She'd cut it on the display case when she was pushing through. He believed her. I watched his face, and he believed her. I checked Claire's arms, her neck, her hands. She let me do it without asking why. She already understood. Nobody was bitten. I said, "We're not going out the front. We're going out the back, the way I came in. Through the stockroom, through receiving, out the dock." Kevin said, "Then what?" I said, "My truck is parked behind the delivery trucks. It's a regular cab F-150, so not everyone fits in the cab, but there's a bed. We can manage for a short distance. Tina said, "My son, my mother, they're in my car in the parking lot." I said, "Are you sure they're still there?" She nodded. "I've been texting. My mom keeps responding. They're in the car. They're locked in. She's been watching through the windshield." "Where are you parked?" "The lot off 14th. The side lot." She meant the smaller lot on the building's east side, which was accessed from 14th Street, the same street I'd come in on. That lot shared the service road. If her car was there, it was close. I said okay. Here was the plan. We'd go out the back, through receiving, out the dock. I'd pull my truck around to the east side. Tina would get to her car and get her son and mother. Everyone else got in my bed or in Tina's car. We'd move fast, and we'd move quiet. No running unless we had to. No unnecessary noise. Kevin said, "Where are we going?" And that was the first time I had to answer that question. And it was the first time I realized I didn't have an answer yet. Not a real one. I knew we had to get out of here. I knew the city was wrong, somehow. Broken in a way that wasn't going to fix itself in the next hour. I knew the routes toward home would be unpredictable. What I knew was the bus depot. I said, "I work at the transit depot on Collier. I know every door, every inch of it. The yard is gated, the building is solid, and there are resources there." Kevin looked at me. Not skeptical, just evaluating. He nodded. We moved out through the stockroom. I went first with the pry bar. Kevin came last with... He'd found a fire extinguisher from the wall bracket near the cold room, which was not a weapon but was heavy and solid, and could be used as one. Later I thought about how neither of us had said the thing we were both thinking, which was that the fire extinguisher was for braining someone if we needed to, and we'd both just silently agreed to that without discussing it. The stockroom was the same as when I'd come through. No one in it. No sounds from inside the building. The receiving area was still empty except for the abandoned work. We went out through the dock door. Cool air. The service road. The smell of exhaust from the refrigeration units on the delivery trailers. Nothing was there. No movement. The sounds from the front of the building and from Whitmore Avenue were still there. If anything louder now than when I'd come in. But back here, it was still and almost normal. I got everyone moving to my truck. Brenda and Paul and Scott got into the truck bed without any discussion. Claire got in the cab. Dustin, and I don't know why, but this was the first thing that felt off to me about the whole morning. Dustin stopped halfway to the truck and looked back at the dock door. I said, "Dustin, come on." He said, "My stuff is still in there. My bag, my phone." I said, "We're not going back in." He looked at the door for another second. Then he got in the truck bed. I drove around the building's east side. The east lot was there, about a third full of parked cars, and I could see from here that it was mostly untouched by whatever had happened out front. The customers who'd been here when things started had either fled on foot through the lot or were still in their cars. Tina was scanning the rows, and then she pointed and said, "There. The gray Camry. A gray Toyota Camry in the second row. A woman sitting in the driver's seat that I could see through the windshield from here, and a child visible through the rear side window. I pulled alongside and Tina was out of the cab before I'd fully stopped. She ran to the Camry. The driver's door opened. The woman, Tina's mother, who turned out to be named Grace, 60-something, white-haired, with the look of someone who has been terrified for the past hour, but has held it together, got out and hugged Tina, and then immediately started helping get the toddler out of the car seat. The toddler was named Eli. He was maybe 2, and he had a small fire truck in his hands, and he was the most normal thing I'd seen in the last 20 minutes. I made the executive decision, too many people for the truck, especially with Grace and Eli. Tina's Camry was going to stay in the group. I had Brenda and Scott move to the Camry. Paul stayed in the truck bed because he still wasn't talking, and I didn't want to deal with moving him twice. We got out of the lot onto 14th Street, and I looked both ways before I turned, and I took a second to actually look at 14th Street, which was not the same street it had been 20 minutes ago. There were infected on 14th. That's what I'm going to call them. Infected. Not the other word, not yet. 3 of them visible between here and the next intersection, in various states. One was down on the pavement and not moving. One was standing near a storefront doing nothing. And one was crossing the street slowly, heading south, and as we drove past it turned its head toward the sound of the truck engine. Just turned, tracked the sound, moved toward us. I accelerated. I want to be clear about what these things looked like. Because people always ask. People in the yard ask me what the first ones I saw up close looked like, and I have to think about how to describe it accurately. They looked like people who were sick. That's the simplest version. They looked like people running a very high fever and not sleeping. That gray skin tone, the slightly unfocused eyes, the way they moved with too much effort, like their joints weren't cooperating. They didn't look like movie monsters. They didn't look like they'd been dead and came back. They looked like people whose bodies were in the middle of catastrophically malfunctioning. The one that turned toward us on 14th Street, it had been a woman, maybe 50, wearing a yellow rain jacket, carrying a grocery bag, which meant she'd been infected so recently that she'd still been carrying her grocery bag when she turned. She tracked the sound of the engine, and she moved toward it, and she wasn't fast, not notably fast, but she was committed. No hesitation, no stopping to figure out what she was doing, just movement toward the noise. That's what they are. That's their whole thing. They move toward sound. They bite what they reach. They don't plan. They don't hesitate. They don't try to open doors. They don't do anything but track sound and move. The first week, I kept waiting for them to do something more complicated. They never did. We made it back to Collier Avenue and into the depot yard in about 8 minutes. The gate was still closed, but I had my key card for the pedestrian access, and I used it. And then I used the manual override to pull the vehicle gate open from inside. It's a chain-link gate on a track, heavy, but it rolls. The depot yard when we pulled in was empty, quiet. I could see through the shop windows that the overhead lights were still on inside, which meant power was still running. Dennis's car was gone from the supervisor spot, which meant he'd left while I was gone. I didn't blame him. Walt's truck was still there. I should have thought about that more carefully when I noticed it. I didn't. We got everyone inside through the side entrance, into the shop, which smelled like diesel and grease, and the particular metallic smell of... No, wait. I said I wasn't going to say that. The smell of worked metal, brake dust, the WD-40 that Walt used on everything, regardless of whether that was the right product for the job. Speaking of Walt, Walt was in the shop. He was sitting on the rolling stool near the 2219, which was the bus I'd been working on when Claire called. He was sitting very still. I should have thought about that more carefully too. Walt never sat still. Walt was always doing something, even on his breaks, always had his hands busy, always had some task going. I walked over to him and said his name, and he looked up at me, and I saw that he had blood on his forearm. Not a little blood, a lot. He said, "Got a little cut, I'm fine." I looked at the cut. It was on his inner forearm, and it was a bite. It was clearly a bite. I don't know how he got it. Someone must have come into the yard or into the shop while I was gone. Maybe through a side door that wasn't locked. Maybe one of the infected from the street. But I was looking at a bite wound on Walt Burgess's arm, and he was telling me it was a little cut. I made a decision in about 3 seconds that I'm still not sure was the right one. I said, "Walt, you need to come with us. We're setting up in the break room. I need everyone in there." He said he was fine right where he was. I said, "Walt, buddy, come on." He looked at me. His eyes were okay. Still Walt's eyes. Still in there. Still recognizing me. But the gray was just beginning to come into his skin at the edges, around the jaw, and I could see that he was slightly damp with sweat, even though the shop wasn't warm. He knew. I could see that he knew. He said, "You know what this is, don't you?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "How much time do you think I've got?" I didn't know. I still don't know the exact timeline. I've since figured it out by observation, and I'll get to that. But at that moment, I didn't know. I said I didn't know. He nodded. He said, "You need to get these people somewhere else before I can't." He stopped, pressed his lips together. "Give me an hour. Let me sit here for an hour. Then go. Don't let me be." Another stop. Just go. I stood there, and I didn't say anything. Walt had a daughter in Riverside. He'd shown me pictures of his grandkids about 100 times over the years. He had a thermos of terrible coffee that he brought every day because he thought the depot's coffee machine made coffee that tasted like burned water, which was accurate. He'd been teaching me things about diesel engines since I was 26 years old. I said, "Walt." He said, "Garrett, take your people and go. I'll be okay here. I'll lock myself in." I said, "I'm not leaving you here." He looked at me and he said, "Yes, you are." He said it simply. Not angry, not sad, just a statement of what was going to happen. I stood there for another moment. Then I went back to the others. I've thought about Walt every day since. Not in a guilty way. Not in a way where I replay it and wonder if I could have done something different. He was right. There was nothing different to do. What I think about is just Walt himself. 30 years at this depot. Coffee in his thermos. His granddaughter Emma, who was 4 years old and had just started soccer. I think about the fact that Walt sat on that stool and decided what he was going to do, and he did it with the same calm competence that he brought to everything else. He was a better man than I am. He handled it better than I would have. I gave him his hour. I gathered the group in the break room. Claire, Kevin, Tina, Grace and Eli, Brenda, Scott, Paul. And I explained the situation as clearly as I could without using specific words yet. And I told them what I thought we needed to do. I told them we were going to need supplies. We were going to need a plan. And I told them this building was probably safe for right now, but not indefinitely. And then I went to do what I'd been doing for 15 years at this depot. I went to look at what we had to work with. The depot had, at that moment, 14 buses in the yard. 6 of them were in the shop in various states of repair. 8 were outside in the vehicle yard, plugged into their charging blocks for the hybrid models, or just parked, for the diesel models. All 14 were theoretically operable. Even the ones in the shop were in for maintenance, not catastrophic failures. We also had, in the depot's maintenance supplies, roughly 80 gallons of diesel fuel in the underground storage tank that the facility used for its own maintenance vehicles and for testing bus engines. This was the on-site tank, separate from the fueling station across the yard that was connected to the city's delivery contract. The on-site tank was topped off at the start of every month. This month had started 4 days ago. We had a stockroom with standard maintenance supplies, oils, fluids, tools, safety equipment. We had a small refrigerator in the break room with whatever people had left in it, which turned out to be 1 partial container of creamer, half a sandwich in plastic wrap, a couple of yogurts, 4 cans of soda, and a birthday cake that someone had brought in and not fully finished, still in the bakery box. We had a vending machine in the hall with chips and crackers and candy. We had a first aid kit in the safety cabinet, a real one, the kind that transit authorities are required to maintain, not the 2 expired Benadryl kind I had at home. It had gauze, bandages, antiseptic, burn cream, several types of over-the-counter medication, including pain relievers and antihistamine. We had a landline phone, several of them, throughout the building, though when I picked up the one in the break room, the line was dead. Cell service was intermittent. My phone had 1 bar and was barely loading anything. We had a CB radio in the supervisor's office. I found this later that evening, and it became more important than almost anything else in the building. And we had, and this is the thing that I kept coming back to, the thing that felt like maybe some kind of option, we had Bus 1047. Bus 11047 was an older unit, a 2008 Orion 7, not hybrid, straight diesel. It had been sitting in the yard for about 3 weeks because the transit authority had tentatively decided to retire it from service and was in the process of the paperwork. The Orion 7 at that age needs attention, but it runs. I knew this bus. I'd done its last inspection myself 2 months ago. It needed a new belt on the alternator. The passenger door handle on the front was sticky, and the rear heater unit wasn't working. None of those things were going to stop it from running. I had an idea. The idea was half-formed, and probably stupid, but I was going to think about it. I went back to the break room. The group was doing the thing that groups do when they're scared and don't know each other. They were sitting apart from each other, not talking much, doing individual things. Tina was trying to get Eli to drink something from her water bottle. Grace was on her phone, getting intermittent signal, trying to reach someone. Scott, the teenager, was sitting in the corner, looking at the wall in a way that suggested he was keeping it together by force of will. Brenda, the pharmacy tech, had the first aid kit out and was cleaning the cut on her hand properly. Paul was still in his chair with his back of the store expression. Kevin was at the window, looking out into the yard through the glass panel in the break room door. I told them what we had. I told them about the fuel, the supplies, the buses. I told them about bus 1047, and I told them what I was thinking, which was that a single vehicle we could all fit in, that had enough fuel to take us a significant distance, was better than individual cars that could get separated, or that depended on gas stations that might not be operating. Kevin asked where we were going to go. I told him about what I'd been thinking on the drive over. There was a large industrial area about 6 miles southeast of us. Warehouses, manufacturing plants, a few commercial operations, less residential, less foot traffic on a normal day, and on the far east side of that area, past the freight rail yard, was a place called Dunham Maintenance. Dunham Maintenance was a private vehicle repair facility, similar in concept to what we were currently in, but larger and more isolated. I knew it because the Transit Authority had contracted work to them during a period a few years ago, when we were backed up on repairs. Big lot, high chain-link fencing with concertina wire on top. It was in an area where vehicle theft had been a problem, so they'd invested in security. Multiple large maintenance bays, extensive tool inventory, a small office building attached, and I knew, because I'd been there half a dozen times for work purposes, that there was a generator shed on the south side of the property that held a diesel backup generator capable of running the whole facility. Kevin said, "Why there instead of here?" I said, "Because here is on Collier Avenue, which is a through street that's going to see traffic, infected traffic, for as long as this is going on. Dunham is past the freight yard. You have to know to go there. And the fencing is better." He thought about that. Then he nodded. Claire, who had been sitting at the break room table and listening to all of this without saying anything, said, "How do we know Dunham is empty?" I said I didn't know. I said we'd have to check. She said, "What if there are people there already?" I said that would be a good problem to have. She almost smiled at that. Not quite, but almost. Over the next 2 hours, I worked on bus 1047. The rest of the group helped where they could. Kevin and Scott helped me move tools and get things I needed. Brenda organized the first aid kit and other supplies we were taking. Tina and Grace managed Eli. Claire was methodical and focused and went through the vending machine and break room and made an inventory of everything edible, which was less than I hoped. Walt, I don't want to talk about what happened with Walt except to say that when I went to check on him, about 90 minutes after our conversation, the shop was quiet, and he had locked himself in the parts room, the door from the inside, and there was no sound from in there. I stood outside that door for a minute, and then I went back to work. The alternator belt on 1047 took 40 minutes. Everything else I needed was quick. Checked the fluid levels, checked the tire pressure on all 6 tires including the 2 rear duals, topped off the fuel from the on-site tank using the manual transfer pump. I checked the brakes, checked the lights, started the engine, and let it run for 15 minutes while I finished loading. We loaded the bus with all the food and water from the break room, the full first aid kit, every tool I could rationalize taking from the shop, including the bolt cutters and pry bar I'd already brought from home, 2 fire extinguishers, a collection of safety flares from the emergency cabinet, 3 heavy-duty chains from the parts room for securing gates, a hand crank radio that I found in the safety cabinet still in its box and never used, an 8-foot stepladder, a roll of chain-link fence wire, various lengths of rope, and an assortment of other things that I was grabbing more on instinct than plan. Paul, during all this preparation, finally came out of his daze enough to start being useful. Turned out Paul was, he told me quietly while we were loading the bus, a retired school bus driver, 30 years. He knew buses. He hadn't said anything because he'd been in shock, but once he started moving, he was good. He checked the bus from front to back while I was dealing with the fuel. pointed out that the left rear tire had slightly low pressure, and I addressed it. As I was finishing up the fuel, my phone received a text. 1 bar, intermittent service. But the text came through. It was from my brother-in-law Dale. Dale Pruitt, Claire's younger brother. I'll be honest. Dale and I had a complicated relationship, which is a polite way of saying that for the first 5 or 6 years I was with Claire, we genuinely couldn't stand each other. He thought I wasn't good enough for his sister. I thought he was an entitled pain in the ass who called Claire 3 times a week about things he could figure out on his own. We'd gotten better over the past couple of years, mostly because Claire had told us both to grow up, and also because Dale had gotten married and had his own problems to deal with and stopped fixating on mine. But better didn't mean close. It meant we got through Thanksgiving dinner without an incident. The text said, "Claire not answering. Is she with you? News is saying Bresner's area is a flashpoint. All phone lines jammed. I'm at the house." Dale had his own house about 12 miles north of us. By the house, he meant his own place. I texted back, "Claire is with me. We're okay. Going to try to get to a more secure location. I'll update when I can." He replied immediately, which surprised me. "Where? Can we meet up?" I thought about that for a second. I said I'd send coordinates when we were settled. He sent back, "Be careful," which from Dale felt almost like an apology for something. I showed Claire the texts. She read them, and then she held the phone for a moment, and then she handed it back to me without saying anything, and went back to loading the bus. We left the depot at about 3:15 in the afternoon. 7 adults, 1 toddler, 1 bus, and a Camry following behind us with Grace and Tina and Eli, because I couldn't talk Tina into leaving the Camry behind, and honestly, she was right to keep it. Extra vehicle, extra capacity, and Grace could drive. The route to Dunham was going to take us through about 3 miles of city streets before we hit the industrial area. I'd decided on our route while I was working. Avoid Whitmore entirely. Avoid the main arteries. Use the freight access roads that ran behind the warehouses on the south side. I knew those roads because bus routes occasionally had to divert through them, and I'd driven a couple of the alternates myself years ago during a road closure. Getting out of the depot yard was fine. Collier Avenue immediately outside was not fine. There were maybe a dozen infected visible on Collier between the depot and the first intersection. Most of them were moving in loose clusters, not coordinated, just moving. Some were still, like the man on Fitzgerald had been. The bus made engine noise, and some of the moving ones turned toward us. I didn't stop. I drove through them. This is the part that I think about sometimes. The part that doesn't sit completely comfortably even now. I drove a city bus through people, through things that had been people. I didn't hit any of them. I swerved around the ones that were in the road, and the ones on the sidewalks were too far to the sides to be an issue. But I was prepared to, if I had to. I had already made that decision while I was working on the bus, without explicitly making it. Kevin was in the seat behind me, watching the road. He didn't say anything about it. Paul was in the driver's side seat at the middle of the bus, watching too. Neither of them said anything. We turned off Collier at the first opportunity and worked our way south and east through residential streets. The neighborhoods were quieter than Collier, not empty, but quieter. People behind windows. Some cars that had clearly left in a hurry. One intersection where what looked like an accident had happened earlier. 2 cars pushed into each other, the airbags deployed in one, and now there were 3 or 4 infected clustered near it, not doing anything with the cars, just standing near the wreckage in a way that made no sense if you expected them to have reason behind their behavior, but made perfect sense once you understood they were attracted to the noise the crash had made, and then stayed near the spot after the noise stopped. I noted that. I filed it away. Later it became important. We passed through a stretch of road where every traffic light was out. Not cycling, not showing red, just off. The city's traffic management system had gone down, or power was out in this section. At each dark intersection I stopped and looked both ways before proceeding, because the last thing I needed was a collision that disabled the bus. At one of these dark intersections, on a street called Hargrove, I stopped the bus and sat for a moment, because what was ahead of us had made me pause. Ahead on Hargrove, about half a mile, there was a massive traffic jam. Not from the outbreak, or not directly. It was a government vehicle jam. Police vehicles, a couple of National Guard trucks, civilian cars crammed in between, some emergency services vehicles. They were backed up toward the intersection ahead, and there were people on foot moving through the stopped vehicles, people in uniform directing traffic by hand, and a large sign on a portable stand that I could barely read from here. It said, "Evacuation point, Riverside Park, 2 miles." And there was an arrow pointing right, toward the park. Kevin had come up to stand next to the driver's position. He read the sign. I said, "What do you know about the evacuation points?" He said, "Before I lost radio contact with dispatch this morning, they were talking about 3 staging areas. Riverside Park was one, the convention center was another, and the community college." I said, "Are those good places to be?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Riverside Park is an outdoor location. No walls, no secure perimeter. You'd be dependent on whatever perimeter they've established, with personnel and vehicles, if those start to fail." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. I said, "We're not going to Riverside Park." Nobody in the bus disagreed with me. I backed the bus up, turned us around, and found the freight access road through a gap between 2 warehouses. The road was unpaved but graded, wide enough for the bus, and it ran parallel to the main roads about a quarter-mile back from them. We followed it southeast for about 1.5 miles, jostling on the rough surface, Eli complaining from the Camry somewhere behind us, until we came out onto the industrial road that led to the freight yard. And here we saw something that I still think about. About 100 yards ahead, near the access gate to the freight yard, there was a figure standing in the road. One figure, alone, wearing what looked like a police officer's uniform, standing completely still in the center of the road. I stopped the bus. The figure didn't move. I let the engine idle and waited. 1 minute, 2 minutes. Still didn't move. Kevin said quietly, "That's an officer." Or was. The uniform was there, the dark blue, the reflective stripe on the pants. But no movement, no acknowledgement of the bus's presence, no radio call. And the posture was wrong. The slumped shoulders, the slight forward tilt. I honked the horn. Short, brief tap. The figure turned immediately toward the sound. Infected. Wearing the full uniform, utility belt with everything still on it. Radio, baton, holster, still on the body. It turned and moved toward us, and I put the bus in reverse and backed up about 10 feet, keeping the distance, and watched it. It moved at a walking pace, no running. Consistent with what I'd been seeing, it tracked the bus, which was the noise source, and moved toward it. I honked again. It changed direction slightly to follow the new sound location. Kevin said, "The radio on its belt." I'd already seen it. The utility radio on the belt was lit up. The little indicator light was active. The radio was on, was transmitting or receiving. I couldn't tell from here. I said, "Can you reach that?" He said, "Not without getting closer." I thought about it. The radio was active. It might be receiving transmissions from the department. It might have information. Against that, getting out of the bus and trying to take a radio off an infected officer in the middle of a road. I said, "What frequency does your department use?" Kevin said Channel 2 was the primary patrol channel. He said the CB in my truck might not have department frequencies. Those were encrypted on digital radios. But the old-style portable units sometimes weren't encrypted, especially the older ones, still carried by officers who hadn't updated equipment. I said, "You said you had your personal radio." He pulled it out of his jacket pocket. He'd had it on him this whole time and hadn't mentioned it. I said, "Try 2. He switched to Channel 2, and there was a lot of noise, overlapping transmissions, people talking over each other. But underneath it, there were actual words. Dispatch traffic. Actual ongoing communications. We sat in the bus on the freight access road with an infected police officer wandering in circles ahead of us, and we listened to the radio for about 4 minutes. What we heard, the evacuation zones were filling fast. Riverside Park specifically was having containment issues. That was the exact phrase, containment issues, which was a department way of saying infected had gotten inside the perimeter. The convention center was at capacity, closed to new arrivals. The community college location was not yet established. There were requests for personnel at multiple locations that went unanswered. There was a call for air support that got no response. There was one transmission that I still remember word for word, because it came through clearly between two bursts of static. It was a female officer, calm voice, sounded like she was reading from a checklist. All units be advised. We are implementing fallback protocol at 1700 hours. Fallback protocol, acknowledge. Nobody acknowledged. Kevin's face when he heard that was different, like he'd recognized something. I said, "What's fallback protocol?" He said, "It means they're pulling back." A pause. "It means they're pulling out of the field." I said, "Pulling back to where?" He said, "There are designated secure facilities." But I don't know. I was off duty. I don't know the full current plan. I said, "Are the evacuation points part of the fallback?" He said he didn't know. I said, "If they're pulling out of the field and the evacuation points aren't secured." He said, "Yeah." That was the conversation. I drove around the infected officer using the far edge of the road, giving it as much space as the road allowed, and it tracked us as we went by. In the side mirror, I watched it turn to follow the sound of the engine. It was walking after us, slow and steady, in the direction we'd gone. I drove faster. The freight yard gate was open, not unlocked, but the chain had been cut or broken, and the gate was sitting open. Someone had come through here in a hurry recently. I drove through it. The freight yard itself was large and mostly empty. The rail cars on the sidings were sitting unattended, no workers visible, no movement. We crossed the yard on the service road, through the far gate on the other side, which was also open in the same way the first one had been, and then we were in the industrial area proper. Dunham Maintenance was at the end of Caldwell Road, past a distribution warehouse and a metal fabrication shop. I recognized the gray metal building and the high chain-link fencing as we came around the last corner. The gates were closed. I'd expected this. I pulled the bus up to the main gate and I sat for a moment looking at it. It was a double-wide gate, heavy chain-link, padlocked with a commercial-grade lock. The fence on either side was the 12-foot chain link, with 3 strands of concertina wire at the top. Good fence. I'd been envying this fence since I thought of coming here. I had bolt cutters. I got out of the bus, first checking all directions, no movement visible, just the empty industrial road and the building, and I cut the padlock on the gate. It took about 30 seconds with the heavy bolt cutters from the parts room. A commercial padlock on a chain-link gate isn't the movies, where the hero smashes it off with a tire iron. You put the cutters on the shackle, you apply leverage, and the shackle gives. Took 2 tries because of the angle. I swung the gates open, drove the bus through, got out again and closed the gates behind us, and tied them shut with one of the chains I'd brought, because the padlock was obviously not going to work anymore. The Camry pulled through behind us. Dunham Maintenance was ours. For the next 3 hours, while there was still light, we secured the property. The main building was a large maintenance bay, 4 vehicle bays, each big enough to fit a semi-truck, with roll-up doors on both the front and back. The doors had manual slide bolt locks that were simple but solid. The building also had a ground-level office section, 3 rooms, a bathroom, a break area with a microwave and a real coffee maker, and a small bathroom. The south side of the property had the generator shed I'd remembered, and the generator was there, a big diesel Caterpillar unit, and it had fuel in it. Not full, but substantial. The gauge read about 60% capacity. I estimated we had 3 to 4 weeks of intermittent power if we were careful. I found the property manager's desk in the main office, and in the top drawer there was a key ring with keys to every lock in the facility, labeled in neat handwriting. This was one of those moments where the world gave you a small, uncomplicated gift, and you just took it. Kevin walked the perimeter and came back with a report. The fence was intact all the way around, except for one section on the north side where a post had been hit by a vehicle at some point in the past and was bent inward, compressing the fence down to about 9 feet at that spot. Still passable as security, but weaker. He marked it with a piece of cloth, so we knew where it was. Paul found the tool inventory and spent an hour cataloging it. Dunham had a full commercial maintenance operation. Hydraulic jacks, air compressors, cutting equipment, welding equipment, a full set of hand tools, specialty equipment for heavy vehicles, a chemical storage area with lubricants and fluids, and cleaning solvents. It was better equipped than the transit depot in some ways. Brenda found a small storage room off the break area that had been used as a supply closet. The supplies weren't food, mostly paper products, cleaning materials, a case of bottled water, some first aid supplements. But the water was important. A case of 24 16-ounce bottles, untouched. Tina and Grace settled Eli in the office area with some things from the Camry, a blanket, some books Grace had apparently grabbed in the chaos of the parking lot, a stuffed elephant that went everywhere with Eli. The kid had been remarkably well regulated through all of this, which I attributed to the fact that he was 2 and didn't fully understand what was happening, and to Tina and Grace, who had been extremely careful not to show panic in front of him. Scott, the teenage kid from the cereal aisle, turned out to be good at a specific and useful thing, which was climbing. He was skinny and light, and he went up the fence on the north side of the property like it wasn't anything, scouted the surrounding area from the top for about 10 minutes, and came down and told us. The freight rail yard to the west was clear, no movement. The distribution warehouse to the east had lights on inside, which might mean survivors. The road out front was empty from what he could see, and there was a water tower about a half-mile south that was visible from the fence top, which wasn't actionable information, but was interesting. Claire, as evening came on, took stock of our food situation and delivered the result without softening it. We had enough for about 2 days, maybe 3, if we were very conservative. The break room at the depot, the vending machine, the stuff from the Bresner stockroom that Brenda had grabbed in a bag on our way out, none of it added up to much. We were going to need to find food. This was the first real problem I didn't have an immediate answer to. I sat in the Dunham office as the sun went down, and I thought about food. The distribution warehouse to the east, with the lights still on inside. Scott had seen lights. Lights meant either power running on some kind of backup, or people, maybe both. A distribution warehouse in an industrial area might have any number of things, depending on what they distributed. It could be automotive parts, could be office supplies, could be food service. I didn't know what was in that building, and I didn't know how to find out without going to it. We had the bus, fully fueled. We had the Camry. We had tools. We had a secured location. The question of how to get more food was the first practical survival problem, and I went to sleep that first night without an answer, lying on a folded moving blanket on the floor of the Dunham office, Claire next to me, listening to the fence shift in the wind and the sound of Eli making small noises in his sleep. I didn't sleep well. I'm going to tell you something about that first night that I've only told Claire. Around 2 in the morning, I got up and went to the bathroom, and on my way back through the office, I stopped at the front window and looked out at the yard and the fence and the road beyond. It was dark, no streetlights. Power was out on this part of the grid. The generator was off to conserve fuel, so the only light was what was coming in from the sky, which wasn't much. But there was enough to see shapes, and what I could see at the fence, in 2 spots about 30 feet apart, were shapes standing outside the fence. 2 infected, standing at the fence, not moving, not pressing against it, not doing anything, just standing there. In the dark, not doing anything. I stood at the window and watched them for about 5 minutes. They didn't move. They weren't reacting to sound because there was no sound. Everything was quiet, no one moving, the generator off. They were just standing there. I didn't know what to make of it. I still don't, fully. The thing I've concluded after more observation is that the infected slow down significantly at night. Not because of the dark. They're not afraid of the dark. They don't have a fear response to anything that I've observed. But there's something about low temperature, or low light, or reduced stimulus that makes them less active. During the day, if there's noise, they moved toward it aggressively. At night, they seemed to sort of idle, like an engine that's running but in neutral. This became a piece of information I used constantly. Night movements, night foraging runs. Everything that required leaving the yard happened as close to 2 or 3 in the morning as possible, when the infected were at their least active. I learned that in the first week, but that first night, I just stood at the window and looked at the 2 shapes by the fence and felt a very particular kind of cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. Then I went back and lay down next to Claire, and eventually I slept. Day 2. I want to talk about day 2 because it established a lot of things. Kevin woke up early, 5 a.m., still dark, and he and I worked out a watch schedule. Someone needed to be on watch at all times, at the front window or in one of the elevated positions we identified. The roof of the office section was accessible via an interior ladder, and from up there you had a clear view of most of the yard and the road outside. We set up 2-hour watches, 2 people per shift, rotating through everyone except Tina and Grace, who needed to manage Eli. 7 adults, minus Tina and Grace, minus Paul, who we weren't sure about yet, left 4 people available for watch. Me, Kevin, Claire, and Scott. 4 people, 2 per shift, 2 hours each. The math worked if everyone did their job. Paul watched us set this up and then he said, "I'll take a shift." I said, "You sure?" He said, "I drove a school bus for 30 years. You think I can't stay awake and watch a fence?" I said, "Okay, 5 adults." The first order of business, as soon as it was light enough, was the distribution warehouse. I went with Kevin. We left at first light, about 6:30, on foot, because the walk was only about a quarter mile, and I didn't want to start a vehicle if I didn't have to. We went out the side personnel door in the fence, which I locked behind us with the deadbolt from the inside, and we went quickly along the edge of the road with the fence line to our backs. The distribution warehouse was a big corrugated metal building with a loading dock on the far side from us, and a small personnel entrance on the near side. The lights were still on inside. I could see them through the clerestory windows near the roofline. There were 2 vehicles in the small lot in front, a pickup truck and a cargo van. Kevin knocked on the personnel door. We waited. Nothing. He knocked harder. A voice from inside, muffled by the door, said, "Who is it?" Kevin and I looked at each other. He said, "My name is Kevin Marsh. I'm a police officer. We're survivors. We have a secured location nearby. We're looking for supplies and trying to account for people in the area." Silence. Then, "How many of you?" Kevin said, "2 of us here. We have 9 people at our location, including a child." Another silence. Then the sound of something being moved, a bar or a box, something that had been stacked against the door, and the door opened. The man who opened it was about 50, heavy-set, wearing a Dunham Distribution Company polo shirt, which answered the question of what was in this warehouse. His name, he told us, was Roger Bates, and he was the night shift supervisor at the warehouse, and he'd been here since yesterday afternoon when his day shift replacement hadn't shown up, and he'd called to check on things, and then the things he learned about had made him decide to stay rather than drive home. Roger Bates. I need to describe Roger because Roger is going to become important. He was the kind of person who seemed like he was made of more solid material than most people. Wide through the shoulders, a face that had been weathered by years of working outdoors before he moved to warehouse work. Hands that were broad and capable looking. He spoke in short, direct sentences, and he made eye contact, and he had the calm of someone who'd made some decision about how he was going to be in the world and was sticking to it. He asked about our situation. We told him. Short version, the grocery store, the depot, getting to Dunham. He listened without interrupting. Then he said, "I've got food." I said, "What kind of distribution?" He said, "Restaurant supply, dry goods, canned goods, some refrigerated stuff, but the refrigeration is on backup power, and I don't know how long it'll last." I said, "How much?" He said, "Come look." We came in and looked. Dunham Distribution Company supplied restaurants in a 3-county area. The warehouse held their inventory before it went out on delivery routes. What Roger showed us was approximately what I can only describe as enough. Enough wasn't the right word. It was vastly more than enough. Industrial-size cans of tomatoes, beans, soups, sacks of dry pasta, cases of cooking oil, palletized supplies of staples, rice, flour, sugar, salt. In the refrigerated section, which Roger had partially converted to run on the backup power generator in the warehouse, there were commercial quantities of things that would last a while if kept cold, and things that needed to be used soon if the power became unreliable. We spent about an hour making 2 runs with the cargo van back to Dunham Maintenance, loading what we could carry in terms of the shelf-stable items. There was much more than we could take in 2 runs. There was much more than we could take in 10 runs. The supply problem was solved. Not forever. Nothing is forever. But for a very long time. Roger came with us on the 2nd run and didn't go back. I want to be clear. I didn't invite Roger. He came. He brought the cargo van keys. And he came. And he didn't ask if it was okay. He just did it. I thought about saying something and then I didn't. Because the man had just given us a year's worth of food, and refusing his company would have been both rude and stupid. He was useful from the moment he arrived. He knew tools, he knew machines. He knew how to move heavy things efficiently. He and Paul became a kind of older man working duo. Not friends exactly. They were too different for that. But they functioned well together. The group was now me, Claire, Kevin, Tina, Grace, Eli, Brenda, Scott, Paul, and Roger. 10 people and a 2-year-old in a fenced maintenance yard with a year's worth of restaurant supply food. It should have felt better than it did. I'm going to skip ahead a little, because the first week is a blur of work and I don't want to just list tasks. The important things that happened in the first week. We established the night watch system, and it worked. 2 people on at all times. No incidents at the fence, though we counted as many as 8 infected standing outside at one point. At night, in that strange, idling way. In the daytime, if there was noise in the yard, we'd sometimes see them on the road moving toward the fence. The fence held. We were quiet in the daytime. I set up the CB radio from the depot in the Dunham office and spent a significant amount of time scanning frequencies. I found 2 active channels. One was official emergency management traffic that was becoming less and less frequent as the first week went on. And one was a community channel where survivors were talking, leaving messages, trying to organize. The emergency management traffic told me the following things over the first week. The National Guard was establishing a secure corridor along the highway on the east side of the county, about 15 miles from us. The 3 original evacuation points, Riverside Park, the Convention Center, the Community College, had all been declared compromised. The official guidance was now to shelter in place in secure locations until further notice. Shelter in place. We were already doing that. I tried to reach Dale through the CB but never got a response. My phone had no service at this point. The cell network had either been destroyed or been deliberately shut down. I wasn't sure which. The CB was our window to the outside world. Kevin's radio, the department radio, stopped receiving useful traffic after day 3. Whatever organized response the department had maintained collapsed somewhere in those first 72 hours. The channel went to static and occasional fragments, nothing coherent. On day 4, Scott climbed back up to the top of the fence and did a longer observation from up there. He was up there for about 20 minutes, and when he came down he had a question I hadn't been expecting. He said, "There's something at the freight yard." I said, "What kind of something?" He said he couldn't tell exactly. Movement. People. He thought they were people, not infected, because of how they were moving. Deliberate movement, not the directionless drifting of the infected. They were in the freight yard, near the rail cars, doing something. I went up the fence myself and looked. He was right. There were people at the freight yard, 4 or 5 of them visible from this distance, moving with purpose among the rail cars. One of them appeared to be carrying something, a weapon maybe, a long tool, some kind of bar. They were too far away to see faces. I came down and told Kevin what I'd seen. Kevin said, "We should make contact." I said, "Or we should wait and see who they are first." He thought about that. He agreed. We watched the freight yard over the next 24 hours. The group there appeared to be establishing some kind of position among the rail cars, using the cars as walls, stacking things, creating spaces between them. Smart, actually. Rail cars are made of steel, and they're heavy, and the infected aren't going to move them. If you set up in the spaces between them, you have a naturally reinforced perimeter. On day 6, 2 people from the freight yard group appeared at the road outside our fence. A man and a woman. The man was carrying a tire iron in a way that wasn't quite threatening, but wasn't quite not threatening either. The woman was maybe 30, had a child's backpack over one shoulder that looked completely out of place, and she raised both hands in a simple gesture when she saw someone at our fence. The man's name was Danny Watts. The woman was his sister, Lynn. They had 4 people at the rail yard. They'd set up in the maintenance building there, the little building that rail companies keep near freight yards for their crews. They'd been there since day 1. I won't pretend there wasn't a moment of calculation on both sides. These were strangers. The world had become a place where strangers could be dangerous. Not because of infection, but because people under pressure make hard choices. I'd already thought about this. I'd already had a conversation with Kevin about it, about how we were going to handle it if other groups appeared who wanted what we had. What I'd decided, what we'd decided together, was that we were going to be careful and clear and honest, and we were going to try to be useful to people without opening ourselves up to risk. We weren't going to turn people away. We weren't going to ignore a 2-year-old freezing in a rail yard. Lynn's backpack turned out to be full of medication. She'd been a pharmacist's assistant, not pharmacist, assistant, and she'd been at the pharmacy supply place in the industrial area when things started, and she'd grabbed what she could: antibiotics, pain medication, blood pressure medication, several other things I couldn't identify. She was carrying this pharmacological treasure in a kid's backpack with cartoon cats on it. Danny was a forklift operator at the distribution warehouse, not the Dunham distribution one, but a different company. And he was strong and competent and quiet, and his instinct in a crisis was to do what needed to be done without talking about it excessively. The other 4 at the freight yard, a middle-aged couple, Ray and Helen Croft, who'd been driving through the industrial area when their car had broken down. I fixed it later. And 2 young men, brothers, named Jeff and Todd Sloan, who worked at the metal fabrication shop and who were, I'll be honest, not the most useful additions to the group, but who were willing and who tried hard. We had a compound now. That's what I started calling it, because maintenance yard was technically accurate, but it didn't capture what it had become. The compound, a Dunham maintenance yard in an industrial area southeast of a city, housing 13 adults and a 2-year-old, with a year's worth of food, a functioning generator, a full tool inventory, a secured perimeter, and a routine that made things feel, if not normal, then manageable. It was around week 2 that things started to get complicated. Kevin came to me one morning. This was maybe 12 or 13 days in, and he was looking at his department radio in a way that suggested something had changed about it. I asked what was up. He said, "It came on last night." I said, "What came on?" "The radio. I usually leave it off, conserving the battery. I turned it on for my 2 a.m. watch, and there was traffic on channel 2. I said, "What kind of traffic?" He said, "Not emergency management, not department dispatch. It was someone talking, one voice, male voice, giving information about the infection." I said, "What information?" Kevin put the radio on the desk between us and looked at it for a second. He said, "Do you remember the first night here? I told you I'd been responding to a call that morning." I said I remembered. He said, "I wasn't just picking up groceries. I'd gotten a call from dispatch that morning, before I went to the store, about a disturbance at a water treatment facility on the north side. Someone had called it in, a trespassing complaint. Someone at the facility said they'd found unauthorized people in the treatment area. I was going to go check it out before my shift started. Then I went to the store first, because it was on the way, and I figured it would take 5 minutes, and then..." He gestured at the room around us, at everything that had happened since. I said, "And?" He said, the voice on the radio last night was giving a location. Specifically, it was giving the address of the Northgate Water Treatment Facility. I said, that's the facility you were called to. He said, yes. I said, what was the voice saying about it? Kevin put his hands flat on the desk. He was choosing words carefully. He said, it was saying that the source of the outbreak was a contamination event at that facility, that it was accidental, that it was a compound that was being tested. He said, field tested. I don't know what that means exactly. A compound that was supposed to be he used a technical word, something about viral suppression, but that it had the wrong effect in humans. Parasitic effect, he said. It got into the water supply. Nobody caught it for almost 3 days, because the test was being run by a private contractor and they hadn't notified the city health department. I sat with that for a moment. I said, who was talking? Kevin said he didn't give his name. He gave the location and a lot of technical information. And then he said, and this is word for word because I wrote it down, he said, if you're in the Southeast Industrial Corridor, you have to know about this. The compound is water-soluble and environmentally unstable. It breaks down. The exposure window was concentrated. People who are infected will not remain infectious indefinitely. They will become inert. I said, inert. Kevin said, that's the word. I said, what does that mean? Kevin said, I think it means they die, or they stop functioning. Not now, not quickly, but eventually. I stared at the radio on the desk. I said, how did he know we were in the Southeast Industrial Corridor? Kevin said, he didn't, specifically. He was broadcasting on a rotating channel sequence. I figure he was hitting multiple frequencies to try to reach whoever could receive. It wasn't directed at us. I said, do you believe him? Kevin was quiet for a long time. Long enough that I thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, I know the Northgate Water Treatment Facility was flagged in a department briefing about 6 months ago. I remember it because it was unusual. It was a public health thing, not usually a department issue. Something about regulatory violations, some kind of testing being done without full permits. I didn't follow up on it. It wasn't my area. I said, so there was already something wrong at that facility. He said, something was being flagged. Yes. I said, why didn't you tell me this before? He didn't answer right away. I watched his face. He said, because I'm the one who got the call that morning, and I didn't go. I went to the grocery store first. If I'd gone when dispatch called, if I'd gotten there 15 minutes earlier. He stopped. I said, if you'd gotten there 15 minutes earlier, you'd probably be standing outside our fence right now. He said, maybe. I said, Kevin, nobody could have known. He said, I'm a cop. Part of what I get paid for is knowing. I didn't have anything useful to say to that, so I didn't say anything. What I did was, I told the group that night, all of it, the water treatment facility, what the voice on the radio had said, the fact that the infected might not be permanent, that this might have an end. The reaction was mixed, which is the honest description. Roger was skeptical. He wanted to know who the voice on the radio was and why they should believe it. Brenda, the pharmacy tech, said the description of a viral suppression compound gone wrong was scientifically plausible, which I didn't understand fully, but which seemed to impress Kevin. Paul said nothing, but I noticed him sit up a little straighter when I told them the part about the infected becoming inert. Scott, the teenager, immediately asked how long it would take. I said I didn't know. The radio voice hadn't said. Claire asked me, after everyone else had gone to sleep, what I thought. I said, I think it doesn't change anything we're doing right now. She said, you believe it? I said, I believe something caused this. Whether it was the water plant or something else, I don't know. I believe he knows something, because he had the facility name, and Kevin had that facility name already, from a different source. That's not nothing. She was quiet for a while. Then she said, Dale called me a lot last year about the water quality notices in his neighborhood. I said, what neighborhood is Dale in? She said, Northgate. I had not known Dale lived in Northgate. Claire and I don't talk about Dale extensively. I had known he was on the north side of the city, but I hadn't known specifically Northgate. Northgate was the district immediately surrounding the Northgate water treatment facility. I said, "Claire." She said, "I know. He got the water notices. He complained about the taste. He got a filter for his tap. That's all." I said, "Okay." She said, "He lives right there." "Garrett?" I said, "I know." We didn't talk about it anymore that night. Around week 3, I've been trying to keep track of days on the office calendar, marking them off in the morning, and I think it's day 21, but I might be off by 1 or 2. The compound was running with something approaching efficiency. We had a full daily routine. Meals twice a day. Roger had taken over cooking, which nobody objected to, and he was surprisingly good at it, producing actual decent food from restaurant supply cans that tasted like something you'd choose to eat rather than something you were eating because you had to. The kitchen was the Dunham break area, with the electric range on generator power during the morning cooking window. We had the generator running on a strict schedule, 2 hours in the morning, 1 hour in the evening. This gave us enough power for cooking, for charging devices, for running the office equipment including the CB radio. The Caterpillar generator had settled into a rhythm that seemed sustainable for the fuel level we had. I'd been working on the vehicles. We had 3 now in the compound: Bus 1047, the Camry, and the cargo van from the distribution warehouse. I'd done full maintenance checks on all of them. The van's rear wheel bearing was starting to go, which I addressed. The Camry needed an oil change, which I did with oil from the Dunham supply. Bus 1047 was running well. I checked it daily. The fence had been reinforced at the weak section on the north side. Kevin and Danny spent 2 days working on it, with extra chain link material from a roll in the Dunham storage. The concertina wire was extended around the full perimeter. We had what I'd call an honest fence now. The days had a shape to them, which was important. Without a shape to the days, people got into their heads. Idle time at a compound like this is the enemy. Not because there isn't enough to do, there's always something to do, but because the idle moments were when people's heads went to the places where all the bad things lived, the people they were cut off from, the things they didn't know, the things they did know and couldn't do anything about. The watch rotation ran smoothly. Roger had asked to be assigned to the early morning watches, 3 to 5 a.m., because he said he'd always been an early riser, and in 15 years of night shift work, his sleep was already backwards. He took the 3 to 5 watch every night, and he was reliable, and he never once slept on post. Except, there was a night around day 17 where Roger didn't show up for his 3 a.m. watch. I was doing the 1 a.m. to 3 shift with Scott, and at 3 o'clock I went to Roger's sleeping area. He'd set himself up in one of the vehicle bays, had a cot and a sleeping bag, said he liked the space, and he wasn't there. I woke Kevin. We did a quick sweep of the compound. Roger wasn't on the property. The side personnel door in the fence was unlocked, not open, locked from the outside, which required a key, and we only had 2 keys to that lock, and one of them was in my pocket, which meant Roger had the second key, and he'd gone out. I stood at the fence door and I looked out, and the road was empty. The freight yard in the distance was dark and quiet. The night was cool, and there was no sound, except the distant hum of something. Machinery maybe, far away. I didn't go after him. I know that sounds wrong, but I had 12 other people in that compound, including a toddler, and opening the gate and going into the dark after a full-grown adult man who had evidently chosen to leave was not something I was going to do at 3 in the morning. Kevin and I took the watch ourselves for the rest of the night, 2-hour shifts each. Roger came back in the morning. At around 7:30, he knocked on the fence door and I let him in. He didn't offer an explanation immediately. He looked tired, not physically harmed, no blood, no injuries visible. He had, and I noticed this because I notice things mechanically. It's how my brain works. Mud on his boots from somewhere. Red clay mud, not the gray industrial grit that was everywhere around the compound. I said, "Where were you?" He said needed to check on something. I said, "Roger, you left the compound at night without telling anyone, without anyone knowing. Do you understand what that means for the watch schedule? For..." He said, I understand. I'm sorry. He said it straightforwardly, not defensively. I needed to go, and I didn't want to explain it. I said, explain it now. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, I have a place, a few miles from here. I go check on it sometimes. I said, a place. He said, my mother's house. She's been gone for 2 years. She passed, and the house is empty. I go check on it. I said, you walk to your mother's house in the middle of the night when there are infected out there. He said, I know the route. I know how to move. I said, Roger. He said, I made it there and back. I'm fine. The red clay mud. His mother's house had a red clay garden, maybe. I thought about asking where exactly his mother's house was. I thought about asking what route he took and whether there was red clay on that route. I said, you tell me next time. Before you go, you tell me. He said, okay. But he didn't tell me the next time, or the time after. I want to be honest about Roger. He was one of the most useful people in the compound. He was competent and reliable, and I never had any indication that he wanted to harm anyone or that he was working against us. But 3 times over the following week, he disappeared at night, the middle of the night, during his own watch twice, and returned in the morning, mud on his boots. Each time I asked him, each time, checking on his mother's house. Kevin pulled me aside after the 3rd time and said what I'd been thinking. He said, I want to run a route from here to the nearest red clay soil. I said, the Northgate district, about 4 miles north. Kevin said, I know. I said, you think he's going to Northgate? Kevin said, I think he might be checking on something other than his mother's house. I said, like what? Kevin said, I don't know, but I'd like to. I said we can't follow him without leaving the compound short-staffed at night. Kevin said, no, but we could ask him differently. I said, differently how? Kevin said, tell him we know about the water facility. See how he reacts. I thought about that. It was a small test, the kind of test you feel slightly guilty about doing. That evening, at dinner, Roger's chicken stew from industrial cans, which was genuinely good. I mentioned, casually, the radio message Kevin had picked up, the water facility. The accidental contamination. I watched Roger as I described it. His spoon stopped moving. Not dramatically, just, it paused, for about 2 seconds. Then he continued eating and said, that's a theory. I said, do you know something about it? He said, I know the city's water plant is on the north side. I've driven past it. I said, Dunham Distribution. Do you supply anything to facilities in that area? He put his spoon down. He looked at me. He said, what are you actually asking me? I said, I'm asking if you know something about how this started that we should know. The table was quiet. Everyone was listening. Lynn from the freight yard, who'd joined us for dinner, and who'd been working with Brenda on medication inventory, put down her fork. Paul looked up from his bowl. Roger was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I drove delivery to the Northgate facility once a month for 6 months. Cleaning supplies, maintenance supplies, some food service for the facility cafeteria. Nothing unusual. But the last delivery, about 3 weeks before all this, I had to wait at the loading dock for almost 2 hours because something had happened inside, and they were doing some kind of lockdown procedure. I asked the loading dock manager about it. He said there'd been an equipment malfunction in the water treatment section. He said it was handled. I signed for my delivery and left. The table was still quiet. I said, did you tell anyone about that? He said, I reported it to the company. My boss said to leave it. It was the facility's business. I said, and the night walks. He looked away from me, at the table. He said, I have a brother. He lives in Northgate. I said, his name. He said, Eddie. His name is Eddie. I said, you've been going to check on your brother. He said, he's not. He lives right by the water plant. If what the radio said is true, if the contamination was in the water supply, and it started there. He stopped. Eddie doesn't answer his phone. I go to check on his house. I look through the windows. I haven't been able to tell. The room was quiet. Then Grace, who almost never said anything at meals, said, "You poor man." Roger picked up his spoon and went back to eating. His eyes were wet. We didn't talk about it again that night. What I did the next morning, first thing, was go to the CB radio. This had been my habit every morning. Scan the frequencies, see what was out there. The emergency management channel was almost silent now, a pre-recorded message on loop that repeated the shelter-in-place guidance and gave a number for a hotline that never answered. The community channel had fewer voices on it than the first week, which I didn't know how to interpret. On day 23, I found a new channel. Not a radio channel, actually. It was a weird frequency that only the CB was reaching. An odd cross-frequency thing, where some other transmission was bleeding through on an adjacent channel in a way that gave me fragments of it. Not clear, not reliable, but when it was there, it was a voice. A woman's voice. She was giving information. Medical information, I thought at first. Then I realized it was practical survival information. How long food products remain safe, water purification methods, basic first aid for infections. She was like a calm broadcast, steady and informative, repeating the same material in a loop with some additions. She gave what sounded like coordinates at regular intervals, always the same ones. I wrote the coordinates down. I plotted them on the city map I had in the office. The coordinates pointed to a location about 2 miles northeast of the compound, in the industrial area, near, and this was what made me sit with the map for a long time, near the site of an old civil defense installation I'd been vaguely aware of, one of those 1950s-era things, a fallout shelter or command center that had been built during the Cold War and then forgotten, the kind of thing that appears on old property surveys and nowhere else. I hadn't known Dunham Maintenance sat on top of something like that until day 24, when I was doing maintenance on the drainage channel at the southeast corner of the yard, and I found a metal hatch. It was flush with the concrete floor of the yard, in a corner that was usually hidden behind a stack of old tire storage. Heavy steel, corroded at the edges but solid. There was a handle recessed into the surface, and around the edges of the hatch, very faintly, barely visible through the dirt and grease and decades of grime, was a yellow and black symbol that I recognized immediately. Civil Defense. The old symbol, the circle with the 3 triangles. I called Kevin over. We got the handle out of its recess. It took both of us and a piece of rebar as a lever, and we pulled. The hatch came up with a sound that was part rust and part something else, a kind of exhalation, like air that had been trapped for a very long time and was finally getting out. The smell that came up with it was old concrete and dry dust and something faintly chemical, like the inside of an old steel safe. Below the hatch, a vertical shaft, about 3 feet wide, metal-runged ladder bolted to one side, dropping down maybe 15 feet. At the bottom, a floor, and an open doorway into a space I couldn't see from above. I went down first with my LED flashlight. What I found was a space about 20 feet by 30 feet, the ceiling maybe 8 feet high, walls of reinforced concrete, floor of painted concrete with a non-slip texture. The kind of construction that hadn't been done since the early 1960s, built to last, built to stand up to things that the people who built it hoped would never happen. Along the south wall, metal shelving with sealed containers. The kind of government-issue sealed cans that Civil Defense used for its emergency food stocks. Most of them were corroded and I had no idea if they were still viable, but they were there. Along the north wall, a workbench, and on the workbench, a radio setup. Old equipment, vacuum tubes, the kind of thing that belonged in a museum. Inoperable. And in the center of the room, on a small metal desk, a folder of papers. The papers were a property survey document from 1962 showing the installation's location, design specs, and maintenance schedule. The Dunham property had been built on top of a civil defense substation in 1978, and the contractor had noted the hatch in the foundation survey and, it appeared from the document, simply not told anyone significant about it, or told someone who hadn't passed it on. The hatch had been there, under the tire storage, for 46 years. There was also a handwritten note in the folder, dated 2019, in different handwriting from the typed documents. It said, "Annual inspection complete. Structure sound. Inventory updated. See attached. Note, recommend this facility be formally reactivated. Value as emergency redundancy overlooked. D. Loring, Civil Emergency Preparedness, Bryan County." Nobody had formally reactivated it. D. Loring had left a note in a folder in a shelter that nobody knew existed and gone back to their office and apparently been ignored. I stood in this 40-year-old concrete room and I thought about the word redundancy. How something can be built for exactly the moment you're currently living in and still fail to be where you need it at the right time, because the right hand didn't know what the left hand was doing. I went back up and I didn't tell the group that day. I sat with it. I assessed the shelter, went back down, looked more carefully. The structure was sound, as D. Loring had noted. No water infiltration that I could find, which was rare for a subterranean structure this old. It was dry and cool and solid, and it was invisible from outside the fence. As a last option, as the final card if the compound above was breached, the shelter was that card, and I didn't want people to know about it yet, because I didn't want anyone deciding to live in it instead of working to maintain what we had above. I told Claire, only Claire, that night. She said, "That's either the best or the most terrifying thing you've told me." I said, "Maybe both." She said, "When are you going to tell the others?" I said, "When I need to." She thought about that. She said, "Okay, but tell Kevin." I told Kevin the next morning. He said the same thing Claire said, almost word for word. Then he said, "What about the woman on the radio? The coordinates? Does the location fit?" I said it didn't fit exactly. The coordinates were pointing to 2 miles northeast, not here. But the frequency bleed from the woman's broadcast was consistent with a nearby transmission source. And if there were more of these old civil defense installations in the area, she might be transmitting from one. Kevin said, "We should find out." I said, "Not yet. We're not stable enough to send people that direction." He accepted that. The end of week 3, day 22, 23, 24. I'm trying to stay organized in the telling of this. There's a moment, though, that I keep putting off talking about. I keep circling around it. I'm going to tell it now because if I don't, I'll never say it. Day 25, evening. I was in the office alone, doing the CB scan. Generator running. The low buzz of it from the south end of the yard was the constant background noise of evening in the compound. I'd gotten used to it the same way you get used to traffic noise in a city. After a while, you don't hear it specifically. It's just the sound of the world. I was scanning through channels when I heard something on the community channel that wasn't the usual voices. It was a voice I recognized. Not right away. Not immediately. It took about 5 seconds of hearing it before my brain matched it to the person. It was thin and staticky, and it was coming through on weak signal, and it was repeating the same phrase on a loop, like someone had recorded a message and was broadcasting it on a timer. It said, "This is Dale Pruitt, calling from near Whitmore Avenue. I'm sheltering at the south end of the Bresner's block, in the hardware store basement. I've been here for a while. I have a few people with me. We need assistance. This is Dale Pruitt. If anyone can hear this." Then static. Then the message repeated from the beginning. I sat in the office with my hand on the CB receiver. The south end of the Bresner's block was about 3 miles from where I was right now, Whitmore Avenue, which was where Claire had been when she called me, which was where the outbreak had been concentrated, where I'd driven through on my way to the parking lot, where I'd seen the crowd at the main entrance of Bresner's. Dale was 3 miles away in a hardware store basement. Dale, Claire's brother, who had texted me on day 1 and whom I hadn't heard from since. I sat there for a long time. Then I went to find Claire. She was in the vehicle bay, sitting on a tire with Scott, showing him something on a piece of paper. She'd been teaching Scott basic electrical circuit diagrams, because Scott had expressed interest, and because Claire had gotten her HVAC certification before she went into dental hygiene, and she knew her basics. They were drawing on a notepad. I said, "Claire, can I talk to you for a minute?" She looked at my face and immediately got up. I told her in the office, away from the others. I played her the CB. I turned the dial back to the community channel, and after about a minute, the message cycled around again. I watched her face as she heard it. She sat down. I let the message play through twice more. She said, "He's been in that basement since the beginning." I said, "It sounds like..." She said, "He said a few people. He's not alone." I said, "Yeah." She said, "Garrett." I said, "I know." She said, "He's 3 miles away." I said, "I know." She said, "We have to go." And this is the thing. This is the thing I've been circling around. There's the person you are before something like this happens, and there's the person you are after a few weeks of it, and they're not entirely the same person. The person I was before would have gotten in his truck and gone. No question. Family, 3 miles away, you go. That's not even a decision, that's just what you do. The person I'd become was looking at 13 people in this compound, including a 2-year-old, and calculating risk. Whitmore Avenue was in a heavily residential area. We'd avoided it specifically because residential areas had high density of infected in the first days, concentrated near stores and other places people gathered. I didn't know what Whitmore looked like now. I didn't know if 3 miles through the city, at any time of day, was passable. I didn't know who Dale's few people were. I didn't know their condition. I didn't know if the message was current, or if Dale had sent it days ago, and something had happened since. And I had 13 people here who were depending on me not to make a stupid decision. I said all of this to Claire. I said it carefully and honestly, because she deserved the honest version. She listened. She didn't interrupt. When I finished, she said, "I know. I know all of that. And I'm still telling you, we have to go." I said, "Claire." She said, "He's my brother. And even if he wasn't my brother, there are people in that basement, and we have a vehicle and supplies, and we know how to get there. You know what I think of most? Every night when I try to sleep? I think about the fact that we made it out of Bresner's because you came for me. You drove through things to get to me, because I called you." She stopped. "Dale can't call anyone. He's just broadcasting on a loop, hoping someone hears it. And I heard it. I didn't say anything." She said, "You are going to tell me what we need to plan for this, and we're going to plan it, and we're going to go, right?" I looked at my wife. 11 years. The way she'd held it together in the grocery store, waiting for me, sitting in an alcove with strangers, and holding herself steady by will alone. The way she'd organized this compound's food supply in the first days, calm and efficient. The way she'd been teaching a traumatized 17-year-old about electrical circuits 2 hours ago, because she'd looked at him and decided that idle hands and idle minds were the enemy, so she'd given him something to fill both. I said, "Yeah, we're going to go." She said, "Thank you." I said, "Don't thank me yet. There's a lot to figure out. Planning took 2 days. I'm not going to rush through it, because the planning matters. First decision, who goes? I didn't want to take a large group. Every person who left the compound was a person who wasn't on watch, wasn't maintaining things, wasn't there if something happened at the fence. I decided, me, Kevin, and Roger. Roger asked to come before I could ask him. He said he knew the route between here and Northgate better than anyone, because he'd been walking it at night. And he pointed at my face when I gave him the look and said, "Yeah, I know what you're thinking. I was going to check on Eddie anyway." I said, "Eddie is near Northgate. Bresner's is on Whitmore." He said, "Whitmore is 4 blocks from Eddie's street. I know how to move through that area in the dark." That settled Roger. Second decision, timing, night. Everything I knew about the infected said night was the low activity window. We'd leave at 2 a.m., move through the dark, get to the Bresner's block, find the hardware store basement, assess the situation, make decisions on the ground, and be back before dawn if possible. We'd take the van. The van was quieter than the bus, smaller, more maneuverable in tight city streets. I'd installed additional side mirrors and I knew its handling. Third decision, what to bring. This took a serious conversation. We'd bring the CB radio, portable, for communication back to the compound. The department radio for emergency use, basic first aid. The bolt cutters, tools for any access issues. And this was the conversation I had with Kevin privately the night before. We'd bring something to defend ourselves with. I'm not going to be coy about this. We had a problem with defensive equipment. We had the fire extinguisher I'd taken from Bresner's. We had hand tools, pry bars, hammers, things that could be used. We didn't have firearms. I'd thought about this. The compound had no firearms, which was either fine or terrible depending on what you encountered. Kevin said, Danny Watts had mentioned, when they first came over from the freight yard, that one of his people had a firearm. I said, Jeff or Todd? He said Jeff. Jeff Sloan, the younger of the two brothers from the metal fabrication shop. I went to Jeff and asked him directly. He was 23 years old, and he had a .22 caliber pistol, a small handgun, low caliber, that he'd had in his car when this started. He had one full magazine and about a dozen loose rounds. A .22 pistol is not a powerful weapon, but it makes noise, and noise was currency in this situation, both bad and good. It could distract infected. It could also call infected. I left it with Jeff, for the compound's defense. We'd go with tools. Claire spent the night before we left in that particular way she has when she's worried about something. Completely normal, doing things, talking to people, but with this very slight quality to her, like she's turned the volume on herself down one notch. I've known her long enough to see it. She doesn't ask me not to do things she knows I've decided to do. She just gets that quality. I sat with her at the end of the night, in the office, after everyone else was in their sleeping spots. She said, "Tell Dale I was asking about him." I said, "I'll do you one better and bring him back." She said, "And Eddie." I said, "If he's there." She nodded. She put her hand on top of my hand. We sat like that for a while. 2 a.m. Me, Kevin, Roger. Out the fence door. Into the dark. I want to tell this part slowly, because it deserves to be told slowly. The industrial area at 2 a.m. was not the same city I'd known for 40 years. It was the same streets, the same buildings, the same physical geography, but the way a shell is the same shape as the thing that lived inside it. The power was out across most of this part of the city, a few lights on here and there from backup generators, or from buildings that still had power for reasons I couldn't explain, but mostly dark and quiet, in a way that a city is never dark and quiet on a normal night. My mechanic's ears were useful here. I could hear the difference between engine sounds, a generator running, a vehicle a distance away, nothing, more precisely than someone not trained to listen to machines. And I could hear the infected, when they were present, by the sound they make, which is not a dramatic sound. It's a shuffling, slightly irregular footstep, the sound of someone walking without proper coordination, sometimes a low vocalizing that isn't quite a moan, more like the sound a person makes in the very deepest sleep, like they're breathing out with something behind it. We moved through the industrial area quickly. Roger went first. He knew the route. He hadn't been lying about that. He moved through the dark like someone reading a map he'd memorized, leading us through alleys and around loading docks and across a section of railroad siding that was tricky in the dark because the rails were a trip hazard. From the industrial area into the residential fringe took about 20 minutes on foot. This was the transition zone. Warehouses giving way to older commercial buildings giving way to two-story residential streets. This was where I expected to see more infected, and I was right. First one we saw was at an intersection, about half a block away, just standing, not moving, idling. We stopped and watched it for about 30 seconds. It had heard nothing. We were on soft soles. We were moving slowly. There was no engine sound. We went around it by crossing to the other side of the street and going down a driveway between houses and coming out on the next street over. 3 more encounters before we reached the Whitmore corridor, all handled the same way. Stop, wait, go around. Roger's knowledge of the exact streets made this possible. He knew which alley cut through, which gap between buildings existed, which route avoided the open areas where our silhouettes would be visible against whatever ambient light existed. At one point, in a narrow street called Galloway, we heard something that wasn't an infected. It was a voice, male voice, low, coming from a second-floor window above us. We stopped and pressed against the building wall. The voice was talking fast, low, with the rhythm of someone reporting. Not a phone call. The one-sidedness was wrong for that. More like, and I realized as I listened, like someone talking to themselves, a running commentary, the way some people narrate their own thoughts out loud when they're alone. What I could make out, in pieces, something about days, something about, they're slowing down. I told you, I've been watching them, they're slowing down. Something about water, something about a woman's name I didn't catch. Kevin put his hand on my arm and pointed forward. Keep moving. I kept thinking about that voice for the rest of the way. Someone in a second-floor apartment on Galloway Street, alone, watching the infected through their window for 3 weeks, talking to themselves about what they were observing, noting that the infected were slowing down. Consistent with what the radio voice had said, the south end of the Bresner's block, Whitmore Avenue in the night. I had not been on Whitmore since day one, since the drive in my truck, since the chaos of the parking lot. It was different now, not in a good way, not in a bad way, just different, changed. The way a place looks after something significant has happened to it. Some of the storefront glass was broken, cars in the road, some of them moved to the sides, some of them where they'd stopped. No bodies visible. That was something I'd wondered about, and the answer was that the infected were mobile and they'd moved, and the ones that had died, I'd seen 3 or 4 dead ones over the past weeks, collapsed outside the fence, apparently just stopping. They were further in, deeper into the residential areas. The Bresner's grocery store was visible down the block. Dark. The parking lot, I could see the edge of it, was empty. The hardware store was on the corner of the block's south end. A mid-sized hardware and home goods store, the kind that sells paint and tools and outdoor furniture. Dark, like everything else. I found the basement access. This is the thing about hardware stores. A lot of them, the older ones, have a service entrance on the street level that goes directly to the basement. A metal double door in the sidewalk, hinged, the kind that open outward from the ground. You used to see these everywhere on main streets. They're how deliveries used to go to basement storage before loading docks became standard. This one had them. Metal doors in the sidewalk on the Whitmore side of the building. I knocked on the metal doors. 3 slow taps. Nothing. I knocked again. 3 slow taps, then 2 more. A scraping sound from below. Something being moved. Then a voice, muffled by the metal and the concrete between us. Tentative. "Hello?" I said, quietly, as close to the door edge as I could get. "Dale Pruitt." "This is Garrett. Claire sent me." A long pause. Then the scraping sound again, faster, and a thump and a clank, and the metal doors lifted from below and pushed up and open, and light came out of the opening. Battery lantern light, warm and yellow, and in the opening was Dale Pruitt's face. 3 weeks. He looked like 3 weeks. His face was thinner and his beard was substantial, and the skin under his eyes was a color I associate with people who haven't been sleeping right. But he was there, and he was conscious, and he was Dale. He looked at me for a second, and then he looked around me at Kevin and Roger, and then he looked back at me. He said, "You actually came." I said, "You going to let me in or what?" He moved back from the opening. I went down first. The hardware store basement I was impressed, honestly. Dale had been doing good work. He'd set up a functional space in what was essentially a storage room, using shelving and inventory to create divided areas. He'd found or brought in multiple battery lanterns. He had a camping stove that I recognized as stock from the hardware store's outdoor section. The space was organized in the way that organized minds organize spaces under pressure, deliberately, with a logic to where things were that made it easy to navigate. His few people were 7. An older woman named Pat, 60s, white-haired, had been at Bresner's when things started, and had run south on Whitmore when the crowd at the entrance got dangerous, and ended up at the hardware store when Dale let her in. A young couple, Tom and Allison, early 20s, who'd been together in the hardware store when Dale had locked the place down from inside. A man named Gerald who was maybe 45, stocky, who had a first responder certification, not a paramedic, but a trained first responder, which was genuinely useful, and who had been in the neighborhood visiting someone when things started, and had ended up at the hardware store because it was the nearest building with an unlockable door. Two young women, sisters, named Kate and Penny, who'd come in after Dale had already established the basement, found them somehow, through a combination of luck and the fact that Kate had heard sounds from inside the basement and knocked on the sidewalk doors. 7 people, plus Dale. 8 in the basement. They were low on food. Not critically, they had hardware store stock, and Dale had done 2 runs to Bresner's stockroom in the first days, getting through the back the way I had, and had brought supplies back. But they were running down. They were also, I could see it on all of them, the specific weight of 3 weeks of confinement in a basement with 8 people and no real information. They were ready to be done with the basement. I introduced Kevin and Roger. Roger caught Dale's eye and asked if there was anyone from around Northgate in the group. Dale said Gerald. Gerald had been visiting someone near the water plant area. Roger and Gerald had a short, quiet conversation in the corner. I told Dale about the compound. The fence, the generator, the food supply, the shelter we'd found. I told him we had room. We'd brought the van. We could fit everyone in one trip. He said, "Now? Tonight?" I said, "The sooner the better. The infected are less active at night. We should move while we have the window." He said, "Give me 10 minutes to tell everyone and let them get their things." He got 8 minutes, because I wanted to move before 4 a.m. Getting everyone up through the sidewalk doors and into the van was the most frightening 12 minutes of the whole night, and I include the walk over in that. 12 minutes of loading people and bags into a parked van on Whitmore Avenue at 3:40 in the morning, and every sound echoed more than it should have in the empty street. And twice, I had to signal everyone to stop and hold still because I heard the shuffling sound of an infected somewhere nearby. The second time I signaled stop, the infected was close enough to see. It was coming along the sidewalk from the north, moving slowly, that idling walk, no urgency to it, and it was going to walk right past the van if nothing made noise. Nobody made noise. I had my hand up and everyone had their eyes on my hand, and nobody made a sound. The infected walked past the van, 6 feet from where I was standing, with my back against the side panel, holding my breath so hard I could feel it in my chest. It walked past. It kept going south. It went around the corner at the intersection. I let my breath out. Kevin mouthed something at me. It took me a second to read it. He was mouthing, slowly. "I know," I mouthed back. We loaded the last 3 people and the last bags, and I drove us out of there with the headlights off for the first 2 blocks, navigating by the ambient light of the sleeping city, going slow enough to see the road, but fast enough to be past the Whitmore block before anything tracked us. Headlights on once we were clear of the residential area. Drive back through the industrial zone. Roger directing from the passenger seat, his knowledge of the route still accurate in reverse. The compound fence came into view at 4:15. Scott, who had the watch, opened the gate from inside and had it wide enough for the van before I'd even stopped. I drove through, and he closed it behind us. Claire was standing in the yard, which meant she'd been awake and hadn't been on watch and had been standing there. Dale got out of the van. Claire looked at him. He looked at her. She said, "You look terrible." He said, "You look the same." She hugged him. He held on with both arms, and I looked away because that was their moment, not mine. I didn't look away before I saw Dale's face over her shoulder, though. The expression on it was not the expression of someone who's just been rescued. It was the expression of someone who's been carrying something for 3 weeks and has finally put it down. Roger, getting out of the van behind Dale, caught my eye and nodded in a direction that meant later. His conversation with Gerald, the first responder from near the water plant. He had information. I nodded back. After we got everyone settled, the 8 from the basement, filling in the remaining spaces of the compound, showing people where things were, getting Pat sat down with a cup of something warm from the camping stove. Roger and Gerald and I sat in the office with Kevin. What Gerald had seen near the Northgate water treatment facility in the 3 days before all this started, 2 trucks, unmarked, cargo trucks, delivering something to the facility at unusual hours. Gerald said he'd noticed because the trucks came in at night, which wasn't normal delivery practice for a city facility. He'd noticed because his friend's apartment overlooked the facility access road, and they'd been having a late dinner when the second truck came in. He'd thought nothing of it at the time, but after the outbreak, lying in the hardware store basement, he'd thought about those trucks constantly. Roger said, "The delivery I made 3 weeks before, the equipment malfunction they mentioned." I said, "The timing." Roger said, "Yeah." I said, "Do either of you know what they were delivering in those trucks?" Gerald said, "No, but I can tell you the trucks came from. I saw the plates on one of them. I remember because it was a commercial plate from out of state, Montana plates." I said, "You're sure?" He said, "I looked it up before my phone died. Montana commercial plates have a specific format. What I saw was a Montana commercial plate." I said, "That doesn't tell us who." He said, "No, but it tells us it came from somewhere." We sat with that for a while. Then Kevin said, "The woman on the radio, the calm broadcast on the weird frequency you found, she gave coordinates." I said, "Yes." He said, 2 miles northeast." I said, "Yes." He said, "I think we need to follow those coordinates." I said, "Give it a few days. Let the new people settle. Let me make sure the compound is stable." He said, "How many days?" I said, 3. He said, "Okay." What happened in those 3 days was not what I'd planned for. Day 28, 2 days after getting Dale's group out of the basement, Roger's brother Eddie showed up at the fence. Not Roger's brother's body. Eddie himself, alive, walking, lucid, knocking on the fence with his fist and calling out. He'd found us somehow. Roger told me later that he'd left directions, on a scrap of paper, tucked in the mailbox of Eddie's house on his night walks. Directions to the compound, in case. Eddie had waited until he felt safe to move. He'd been sheltering in his own apartment for 3 weeks, on a high floor, eating his way through his kitchen, and then his neighbors' kitchens, when he'd cleared their apartments carefully. He was fine. He was functional. I ran through the assessment on him. I did it on everyone who came in. He was not bitten, not infected, not showing the early signs I'd learned to recognize. He was just a man who'd been alone for 3 weeks, and was no longer alone. Roger's reaction to seeing Eddie come through the fence was the kind of reaction that I don't know how to write about without making it sound like something from a movie, so I'm going to leave it at, it was real, and it was something, and I found something in my eye for a minute, and went to check on the generator. We were 23 people now, 23 adults and 1 2-year-old. The compound was full, not at capacity exactly, but full in the way that felt complete. The kind of fullness where you look around and you think, okay, this is the thing, this is the group, these are the people. Day 29. Kevin and I and Paul drove to the coordinates, 3 miles northeast, in the cargo van, mid-morning. We left Roger in charge, which was a decision I'd thought about and which felt right. The coordinates led us to a stretch of industrial property that looked unremarkable. An old building, low, maybe from the 70s, with a faded sign I couldn't fully read from the road. Chain-link fence, not as good as Dunham's. A vehicle out front, a newish pickup truck, which was the first new-looking vehicle I'd seen in a while. And at the fence gate, waiting, was a woman. She was maybe 55. Short gray hair, practical clothes, a clipboard in one arm. She looked like, the most specific description I have is that she looked like the person in charge of something important, the way certain people have that quality of organized authority that doesn't need a uniform or a title. She said, "You found the frequency." I said, "You were broadcasting for us." She said, "For whoever." You're not the first to show up. I said, are you who I think you are? She said, that depends on who you think I am. I said, D. Loring, Civil Emergency Preparedness. She paused. Then she said, how did you know that? I said, because I found the shelter, the one under the Dunham property. You left a note. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I left that note 7 years ago. Nobody ever followed up on it. I said, nobody followed up, but somebody found it. She looked at me. She opened the gate. Her name was Dorothy Loring, and she had been, until 3 weeks ago, a senior planner with the county's Civil Emergency Preparedness Office. She had known about the Northgate Water Treatment Facility and its regulatory violations, and she had filed 4 separate reports in the past 18 months about the unauthorized testing being conducted there by a private contractor. 4 reports, none acted upon. She had also, and this was the part that took my breath away slightly when she told me, been the one who had sent the voice transmission on the radio, the one Kevin had heard 2 weeks ago, the technical information about the compound, the timeline, the prognosis. She had sources inside the relevant state agencies. She knew what the contractor had been testing. She knew what it had done. And she knew, with reasonable confidence, she said, reasonable confidence, which she was careful to specify, that the environmental instability of the compound meant it was breaking down, that the infected were not going to last. I said, how long? She said, the active period, the most dangerous period, where the infected are mobile and aggressive and capable of transmitting. I believe that window is 6 to 8 weeks from the initial exposure event. We are now 29 days in. I said, 2 to 3 weeks more. She said, based on what I know, I'm not a biochemist, I'm a planner. But yes, 2 to 3 weeks more, and the behavioral indicators I've been observing. She gestured at a set of notebooks on a table inside the building, filled with close handwriting, are consistent with the projection. They're slowing. They're becoming less coordinated. The transmission rate has dropped significantly. I'm not seeing new infected appearing in the populations I'm observing, which means the contamination window in the water supply has largely closed. I thought about the man on Galloway Street, talking to himself about how they're slowing down. I thought about the 2 shapes standing at our fence at 2 in the morning, doing nothing. I said, what happens to them at the end? She said, they stop. I said, they die. She said, biologically, yes, eventually. The compound attacks specific neural functions. Without getting into the mechanics, yes, they stop. I sat with that. She said, your group, how many? I said, 23. 1 toddler. She said, do you have medical capacity? I said, a pharmacy assistant with a lot of medication and a first responder. She said, we can improve on that. She gestured at the building behind her. I have 2 people here with medical backgrounds, and we have equipment. I said, why aren't you coming to us? You're alone here, or nearly alone. She said, I'm running the broadcast. If I move, I lose this setup. She gestured at her equipment, an elaborate radio array, much more sophisticated than anything we had. This reaches people. I've had 6 groups make contact. Yours is the 7th. 6 other groups. I said, are any of them close to us? She said, 2 are within 5 miles. I can give you their frequencies. I said, is there anything that needs to happen after it ends? She said, after is the problem, not the immediate after, the months after. The infrastructure is damaged, some of it badly. The water supply is going to need full assessment. Power grid sections need restoration. Medical system has been devastated. Food supply chains are disrupted. She paused. I've been drafting a recovery plan. It's what I do. I'm not sure there's a government left to implement it. I said, is there a government left at all? She said, locally, partial, state, more than partial, federal. She shrugged. I've heard transmissions that suggest continuity at some level. I don't know the condition. I said, what do you need from us? She said, labor, mechanical skills, verification of locations I've identified, and eventually, when it's safer to move, coordination. I'm a planner without a sufficient implementation capacity. I said, I'm a bus mechanic who accidentally became the person in charge of 23 people. She almost smiled. She said, in my experience, that's the most common way leadership works. I told her I'd come back the next day with Kevin and we'd talk more. She said she'd be broadcasting. Driving back to the compound, Paul, who had been quiet for most of the meeting, said from the back of the van, "Do you believe her? About the timeline?" I thought about it. I said, yeah, I believe her. Not because I can verify the science, because I can't, but because I've been watching the fence for 4 weeks, and what I've seen is consistent with what she's saying. Paul said, 2 weeks more. I said, maybe 3. He said, and then what? I said, then we start figuring out how to put things back. He looked out the van window as we drove through the industrial area. He said, I drove a school bus for 30 years. I said, yeah. He said, first day of school every September. 40 kids on my bus. First day they were always scared. New school, new routes. Didn't know what was coming. I used to tell them, the route is the route. You're going to end up where you're going. It just takes time. I said, that's a good way to think about it. He said, I've been thinking about it for 4 weeks. We drove back to the compound. The gate opened as we approached. Scott, on watch, efficient as always. The yard inside was people, moving, working, Eli chasing something near the vehicle bay, Roger's voice from somewhere giving directions about something, the smell of cooking from the break room, even though it wasn't a mealtime, which meant someone was experimenting with what we had. The compound in the late morning, 23 people doing what people do when they're trying to make something work. I parked the van and got out and stood in the yard for a second. The fence was intact. The generator was running on schedule. The shelter under the yard was there if we needed it, which we might not. The infected outside the fence would stop. Not today, not tomorrow, but they would stop. Dorothy Loring had done the math on it, and I believed her math. 2 weeks, maybe 3. I went inside to find Claire. She was in the office, sitting at the desk, writing something in a notebook. I'd started to notice that she was writing things down, not formally, not deliberately, just jotting things. What we'd eaten, what the count was, what the day had brought. I recognized what it was, because I'd been doing the same thing with this recorder, keeping a record, making it real by writing it down. She looked up when I came in. I said, Dale settling in okay? She said, he and Roger are making friends, which I didn't expect, but I'm glad about. I said, how's he doing? Really? She said, he's okay. He went through something in that basement. He's going to need some time. A pause. He told me about the water quality notices in his neighborhood. I said, Kevin and I think he's fine. No signs. She said, I know. He thinks so too. He's been hyper-monitoring himself. A small, tired smile. Very Dale. I sat in the chair across from her. I said, Dorothy Loring says 2 to 3 more weeks. Claire set her pen down. I said, not definite. She's a planner, not a scientist. But the observations are consistent. They're slowing down. The transmission window is probably closed. We're in the tail end of it. She looked at me for a long time. She said, and then? I said, and then it's a different problem. Recovery problem. Infrastructure. Food supply chains. Medical system. There are 6 other survivor groups she's been in contact with. There's partial government structure still operating at the state level. She said, and us? I said, what do you mean? She said, I mean what happens to us. To this. She gestured at the compound around her. To these people. I said, they go back, eventually. To the city, to their lives, to whatever's left of those things. Some of them might stay here together for a while. I don't know. But eventually, when it's safe to move, people go back. She said, and us, you and me. I said, whatever you want. We go back to the house. I go back to the depot. You figure out what's next for you. We try to help put things back together, she said. The bus depot is probably fine. I said, probably. The buses are definitely fine. You know what's going to be needed when this is over? Transit, moving people. You can't rebuild anything if people can't move. She said, you've been thinking about this. I said, mechanics think about vehicles. She almost laughed. It was very close to a real laugh. She said, Russ. I said, I know. Our dog Russ was at our house. Had been since day one when I left for the depot. I'd left him inside, with dry food and water, but 3 weeks and a bit. I said, he's a tough dog. She said, he's a very tough dog. I said, when this is over, first thing. She said, first thing. We sat in the office of Dunham Maintenance, in the compound we'd made in 3.5 weeks, with 22 other people doing things on the other side of the wall and outside the fence, in the world, things that were slowing down, winding toward stillness. 2 weeks, maybe 3. I thought about bus 1047 in the yard, checked and fueled. I thought about Russ on the kitchen floor, and I thought he was fine. I really thought he was fine, because Russ was the toughest and most self-sufficient animal I'd ever met, and he'd probably found a way to open the refrigerator by now. I thought about Walt, in the parts room at the depot, who'd made a decision and made it with grace. I thought about the man on Galloway Street, talking to his window in the dark. I thought about Dorothy Loring at her radio array, systematically broadcasting into every frequency she could reach, planner brain going, keeping the records, keeping the thread. I thought about day one, 6:30 in the morning, under bus 2219 with grease on my arms, looking up at an exhaust system with a fault code. Phone ringing. Claire. Garrett. People are biting each other. 15 years I'd been maintaining those buses. Every system, every model, every fault code. The thing about maintaining a vehicle is that you are constantly managing 2 things at once. Keeping the vehicle running in the present and watching for the signs that tell you what's going to need attention in the future. You never just fix the thing in front of you. You're always reading the whole system, thinking ahead, planning for the road that's coming. I'd been doing that at the transit depot for 15 years. I'd been doing it here, in this compound, for nearly 4 weeks. The same thing, different scale. There's a version of this story where I was the right person in the right place because I had specific skills that mattered. Mechanical knowledge, understanding of vehicles, of equipment, of what things need to stay running. That version isn't wrong. Those things helped. But there's also a version where I was just a man who picked up the phone when his wife called and drove toward the sound of her voice through a city that was breaking apart around him. Because that's what you do. You drive toward the people who need you. You don't stop to calculate if it's the right decision, because the calculation and the decision are the same thing, and the answer is always go. I did that. And because I did that, I got to a grocery store in time, and I met Kevin and Tina and the others, and I got to the depot and I got bus 1047 running, and we got to Dunham Maintenance, and we built a thing that worked, and we got Dale out of his basement, and we found Dorothy Loring with her clipboard and her notebooks and her broadcasts into every frequency. I got to be here at the end of it. Not the very end. 2 weeks still, maybe 3, but the end in sight. I'm going to turn this recorder off now. Not because I'm done talking. I might never be done talking about this. I might be talking about this for the rest of my life in one way or another. But because there are things to do, and people who need me, and the morning watch is changing, and I told Roger I'd look at something on the cargo van's rear axle that's been making a sound he doesn't like. Strange metallic. No, I said I wasn't going to say that. A sound. On the rear axle. Something that needs to be looked at. That's what I do. I look at things that need looking at. Garrett Hollis. Bus mechanic. Dunham Maintenance Compound. Day 29. We're okay. We're really, genuinely okay.